Journal entry dated October 9th, 1914. In the middle of this damned war, only hope keeps us alive. Fritz went first. No cry, just gone. Vanished in that damned green mist. We'd held here for 2 days, waiting on supplies that never came. Jameson ordered a scouting party. Just like that, Fritz blinks out of sight. Not 10 feet ahead, there's talk it's the Argonne witch, some old wives' tale meant to scare green recruits. Now, maybe not so easy to laugh off. This forest, it holds tight to its secrets. I found an artillery shell nestled in the roots of a beech tree, rusted over like it's been there a century. Makes you wonder how many other lost things this place is hiding. Jameson calls it a holding position. I call it a muddy hellhole. Been raining solid for a week, turning the trenches to soup. My boots gave out 2 days ago. Feet wrapped in rags now, and those are already soaked through. Can feel the rot starting between my toes. Worse than that is the chill. Cuts right to the marrow, the kind no fire can warm. Feels like it's seeping straight up from the bones buried under this cursed ground. They sent me here to write it down. Document the battalion's ordeal, the brass called it. Like anyone back home wants to read about how Private so-and-so gets his guts opened by a shell, or Private What's-His-Face drowns in 6 inches of muck, too exhausted to keep his head up. Easier to talk about heroes and victories. My job is words, not lies. But where the hell do you even start with a place like this? Elliot says I was soft back in training, bookish type, not born for a bayonet charge. Maybe he's right. But what does he know about seeing a man go poof in a swirl of fog? Or about the goddamn whispers that ride the wind when the guns fall silent? This isn't the war the storybooks prepared us for. Yesterday, Sergeant Clark stopped me outside the dugout. I knew the look in his eye. Knew what he was going to ask before he even spoke.
Got anything strange to report, Adler?
Voice low, not wanting the others to hear. He's one of those ones with the stories. Claims his granddad could find water with a willow branch, sense trouble coming. Second sight, he calls it. Some of the men seek him out now, clutching those lucky charms from home. Makes me want to laugh. Those rabbit's feet ain't done them any good down here. But Clark, he saw something at Verdun. Got pulled out of the rubble too late. Been different since. I wanted to be smart, play it off his nerves.
Sergeant, all this damn fog's strange enough for me?
I told him. He didn't smile.
Not the fog. You know what I mean.
Thing is, I did. Even before Fritz disappeared, there was something. I was on watch last night, and I swore I saw movement in the trees. Not Jerry. These were tall shadows, long limbs that didn't seem quite natural. Just when I'd think I caught a bit clear, they'd be gone. Eyes playing tricks in the mist, that's all. I convinced myself. Told myself. But that was before Fritz, and when you can't even trust your eyes, where does a man go from there? I keep telling myself to stick to the hard facts, the howitzer rounds we're down to, the rats nibbling on packs, the exact way a body flops sideways as the last of the life bleeds out. This journal I'm scratching this all down in, it's about the only thing keeping me sane. The pages already have weird marks in places, scrawls I don't remember making, loops and curves. Nonsense. Must be from when my hand was half frozen. And there's one line, just a date, 1912, that pops up at the bottom of a page. I know for a fact I wasn't even in France back then. Jameson keeps telling us the Allies are winning, that we just need to hold on a little longer. He has to say that, I get it. But in his eyes, in those sunken, bloodshot eyes, I see it too. The dark thing gnawing at his guts. Maybe the Argonne witch ain't just a fairy tale after all. Maybe this whole dying forest is its own kind of monster. And here we are. Just the latest fools to stumble into its teeth. The days, if you could call them that, blurred together. Rain, mud, snatches of restless sleep in the dugout that stank of sweat and decaying sandbags. Then the waiting while the artillery duels played out overhead, so loud you could feel your very teeth rattling. In between, Jameson sent out work parties. Improving defenses, he called them. We all knew that meant digging graves on the sly. That gnawing fear got bigger every time those shadows slipped between the trees. Always fleeting, like deer startled by a gunshot, but I wasn't fooled. Deer don't leave your sentries gone with only a faint metallic whiff on the air. No blood, no shell fragments, just that coppery stink. We didn't dare breathe a word to Jameson. Discipline was all he was clinging to, the tight rein on his frayed nerves. Mention ghosts, and who knows if even our iron captain wouldn't crack. Worst nights were patrol duty. Elliot got stuck with me once. Smart as he is, he was starting to crack too.
There it is again.
He hissed.
In the mist. Did you see?
Saw what, damn it? A Hun? Then take the shot.
I snapped at him. Every nerve I had felt wired as thin as barbed wire. There was a strange hitch in his breath.
Not a Hun. Not right. Too long. Shadows on shadows.
We hunkered there, rifles aimed at nothing but shifting green mist. I told myself he was spooked, seeing what he wanted. No, needed to see. Then it came. That low rumble, not from above, from below. Under our very boots, the ground thrummed like a kicked drum. I could swear I felt those old tremors shaking the forgotten bones beneath us. Suddenly there was screaming, German shouts and gunfire erupting from where the other half of our patrol was stationed. Elliot and I started toward the sounds, but in the thick fog, we turned around faster than rookies caught out of bounds. Might as well have been blindfolded. Then, silence. Eerie, unnatural silence. Back at camp, 2 more gone. No bodies, just that same damn tang in the air. Jameson wasn't buying the deserter excuse any longer. Not when his best sharpshooter vanished from a high position in broad daylight. He called it shell shock, battle fatigue. All those stiff upper lip words hiding his own unease. But you can't bandage what you can't see. It's in my journal now, too. Lines I swore I didn't write. Single words on fresh pages. Hungry. Watcher. Lost. Each time I open the damn thing, there's something new. The date 1912 pops up again, but now scrawled right across yesterday's entries. My name surrounded by those strange little loops I first dismissed as frost-bitten scribbles. I start counting the loops, and there's one for every soldier we've lost since Fritz. Every time one turns to wisps on the wind, another goddamn circle is waiting for me back in the tent. If not for Elliot, I might just let that journal sink to the bottom of the nearest mud hole. He swears they're hallucinations, my mind fracturing from the constant shelling. Keeps going on about battle psychosis, whatever fancy medical terms they use back in the hospitals. It's almost comforting, his desperate attempts to explain. Makes me cling to whatever shreds of sanity he offers. But then comes nightfall, and those shadows fester past the edges of our flickering fire. Then comes the tremor beneath my feet, a low groaning of this whole rotten forest. Then a name comes through on the breeze, so soft I might have thought it was my own imagination. A voice I remember. One of the lads buried back along the trail, and the voice doesn't sound far away at all. Elliot hears it too. I catch the way his head whips around, eyes wide and glassy in the firelight.
Adler!
He croaks, then swallows the rest down. It doesn't need to be said. You don't win those arguments with the dead. Jameson wasn't a man for long speeches, but when he did talk, it was like watching a dam about to crack.
40 rounds left for the big guns.
He'd mutter as if to no one in particular.
Food for 2 days if we stretch it thin. 3 if there are vacancies.
It hung in the air, those vacancies, echoing those empty spots left behind where men used to be. Then he'd start on about HQ, how they kept moving those maps around, redrawing lines in some fancy chateau miles from here. Lines we bled to hold. Orders radioed out from men who hadn't set foot in mud deeper than a puddle after a summer rain. Orders meant to turn us into some great machine, grinding the Hun away inch by inch. All it ever felt like was the machine grinding us down instead. This wasn't some glorious charge across an open field, flags snapping in the breeze. This was the waiting, the hunger, the rot setting in everywhere. Inside your body, inside your head. No medals given out for that. I caught up with Jameson the other day, staring at a worn map he kept pinned inside the dugout. Eyes bloodshot, fingers tracing the names of nearby woods and villages.
Remember those stories we heard back in the staging area?
He looked over at me, a glimmer of desperation in those tired eyes.
The locals talking about how this forest had seen too much blood. Too many wars over the centuries.
A chill went down my spine, colder than any fog ever could.
Don't tell me you're giving those old rumors credit, sir.
I said, though fear tightened my voice. I wanted to dismiss it, same as Elliot always did.
Call it grasping at straws.
He grunted. He tapped a name on the map so faded it was almost smudged away.
Villers-Tournelle. There was a siege here 500 years back. Thousands slaughtered. Bodies left by the cartload to rot in the open.
My fingers went numb as I pulled my journal into the dim light. It was that damn date again, scrawled across the page. 1912. That year didn't have meaning for me in the war, but...
Sir?
I began, then hesitated. He wasn't a man for wild theories, especially now, but it couldn't be a coincidence. As always, Jameson cut to the chase.
What aren't you saying, Adler?
Well...
I pointed to a worn inscription I'd copied when snooping in the church cemetery weeks back. A local poet describing those ancient battles.
There's this old inscription. Something about how those forgotten dead have eyes turned skyward, how the forest drinks the blood and remembers those it feasts upon.
It felt insane even saying it aloud. I expected Jameson to blow up, call me a superstitious fool. Instead, he went very still. It was as if every ounce of fight drained out of him right then.
That would explain so much,
he murmured. It was an agreement, not quite, but for the first time, fear outweighed discipline. And I knew it. Those old, rotten tales had seeped into our reality, woven themselves into our desperation. Word about what the captain and I discussed rippled through the camp, not in any open way. Jameson wouldn't allow that. But in sidelong glances, in the hesitant way, certain men edged a bit farther from the tree line when night fell. Even Elliot began to waver. I found him one evening, hunched over my research notes, papers on pre-war geological surveys, stolen glances into a history book smuggled out of a half-ruined farmhouse. His face was ashen, the mockery replaced by something close to awe.
They say some battlefields. They become thin places,
he muttered. The voice of reason sounded as weak as a candle flame in a gale.
Where time slips, echoes bleed over into...
Hallucinations brought on by fear?
I asked insistently. I had to insist. I could feel the floor tilting beneath my feet, the solid ground crumbling into shadows. That journal was open beside him, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. Elliot scoffed, but there was no conviction behind it.
This whole blasted war is a hallucination. Maybe that fog isn't coming from the ground at all. Maybe it's coming from...
He gestured with helplessness, eyes darting at the deepening twilight beyond our dugout. As if his fears had willed it, the rumble came then. And even Elliot couldn't deny there was hunger in that groan, a longing older than our little war. That evening, when taps played for those we'd lost, a new sound answered back. A mournful call echoing between the trees. Whispers snaked around the men. Home, they thought they heard, or help, or the name of a sweetheart back in England or France. They started seeking out Clark, clutching at straws. His tent lit up in the night, and I'd see him pacing there, hunched shoulders as if weighed down by something monstrous he'd glimpsed that afternoon in the trenches, when that tremor took the earth below us, and 3 more lads with it. That's when I started watching Clark more closely. The stories had always been there, lurking at the edges. How he never seemed to get hit, even when men around him dropped. How he'd pull wounded out of shell craters, swearing some voice he heard led him the way. Now those tales took on a chilling new sheen. He wasn't just a soldier touched with luck. He was connected, somehow. Connected to this darkness, in ways the rest of us weren't meant to comprehend. That day started the same as the rest, the only marker of time the sky above shifting from dull gray to darker gray. We spooned down the watery concoction that passed for supper. No bread left anymore, just what looked like sawdust boiled in muddy runoff. I glanced around, etching what felt like last glances. Walsh with his one good eye fixed on the trees. Himmler, no older than I was, picking at a scabbing wound on his hand. Sergeant Clark, face gaunt like an old biblical prophet. A tattered bit of leather tied around his wrist. We shared a nod, an acknowledgement, and maybe a goodbye. Night brought that constant oppressive weight to the air, an anticipation worse than an open enemy charge. With darkness came the fog, coiling thick as wool around the trees, those monstrous black silhouettes against the last of the dusk. I caught myself wishing for the artillery again. At least those fiery flashes lit up the hell we were in. This lurking dark was something far more primal. Maybe that's why when the whispers rose in the twilight, it was only half surprise. We heard them before, faint and carried on the breeze. Just snatches. This was different. They sounded closer, and for the first time, I recognized the guttural inflections of German issuing commands. Then I heard Elliot's sharp gasp beside me. He wasn't muttering dismissals this time. He was reciting fragments of his Latin lessons from school years ago. Even in the half-light, I saw the sheen of sweat on his face.
What are they saying?
I choked out.
Calling out names.
He whispered back, a tremble in his voice I hadn't known he was capable of.
Our names. Reciting them.
A shot split the air from our trench, shattering the eerie spell, and all hell broke loose. Except it wasn't the pitched battle we expected. The German attack started and fell silent in bursts, scattered and disorganized. Shrieks erupted in the no-man's land between us, screams echoing in the stillness, until a chilling realization swept over me. There weren't enough voices yelling back. One side or the other had men, lots of them, disappearing into the night. Just then, something grabbed my ankle in the darkness. I twisted, kicking as a figure tried to haul me out of the trench. The face that loomed above was twisted with terror, and it wasn't a German uniform beneath the mud.
Adler, it's me. Hicks.
He stammered out.
Help, for God's sake, they're...
Then the world seemed to yank him upwards, and his final scream turned into a choked gurgle that cut off all too soon.
Thomas, move!
Jameson bellowed, pulling me back roughly by my collar. I stumbled, falling to my knees beside him as another surge of panic erupted amongst our men. There, in the flashes of sporadic gunfire, I saw another shape rising from the mist. Not just a single soldier, but a mass of writhing forms, something impossibly tall, impossibly wrong. Its limbs were too long, too numerous, and I swear they shifted and flowed like the mist itself. That's when my frantic brain latched onto Clark's leather amulet. It was talk of ancient pacts and the spirits of this tormented ground. From out of my pocket came the scrawled map from my frantic research. An insane hope sparked in the firestorm as Jameson shouted his orders, barking out commands the rest wouldn't follow if they'd even understood. And in a voice almost as loud as the gunfire, as steady as I could force it, I shouted a name I'd scarcely recognized until now.
Villers-Tournelle!
The word echoed eerily, and even Jameson stared at me as if I'd lost my senses.
We need to reach what's left of Villers-Tournelle.
My journal said a stream bordered the ruins, some half-baked theory about running water confusing whatever things stalked the woods. It was flimsy, absurd, and it was all we had. Jameson hesitated, the battle rage still in his eyes warring with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a floating branch.
Fall back to the stream,
he roared, his voice echoing. He gestured wildly at me, eyes fierce.
You better damn well be right, Adler. I swear you better be.
Through the chaos, guided only by blind instinct and the desperate press of fleeing men, I led them. In the fog, even the familiar trench line blurred, but we scrambled. I glimpsed it, a dark line slicing through the mist. The old maps called it a brook, barely there. That would have to be our savior. And then Clark was beside me, the leather amulet dangling like a madman's talisman, as he uttered something under his breath. German? Perhaps older even than that. His call was answered by a roar, not of gunfire, but a deeper, earthly groan, and the crack of what sounded like giant trees splitting. My world descended into frenzy. Men pushed past me, shoving towards the stream, and for a horrifying moment, I lost sight of Elliot. The fog thickened, closing in like a shroud, and then ice. Cold that made the Argonne winter feel like a balmy night. Shapes flitted past, too fast, too strange to comprehend in the gloom. And above it all, a hunger unlike anything I'd known, pressing into my skull like a blade. One thought pulsed alongside my heartbeat. Lost. 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 I scrambled for my journal then, fumbling in the fog. Not for writing this time, but to tear out a page. I saw it clearly then. Not my writing, but those jagged loops. They formed a circle, and at its center, one more inscription, Sanctuary. My hand moved then, driven by some force outside myself as I knelt on the muddy bank and scrawled that circle in the earth. I felt Clark beside me, the air suddenly sharp with the metallic smell of ozone. His chanting came louder, almost in time with the rumble beneath our feet. I don't remember climbing on the back of that transport truck. My hands probably moved without me willing them to. Don't recall much of the next several hours either. Only snatches. Elliot's face pressed close to mine. Cold metal of a flask pushed to my lips, his hand shaking so terribly his teeth rattled against the rim. It burned going down, fire spreading to numb the relentless chill inside and out. When my teeth stopped chattering, it was his voice I heard. Not sarcastic anymore, but raw and thin with strain.
It worked,
he whispered.
That circle thing you did. Damn it, don't pass out on me.
He hauled me over one shoulder, staggering a few steps in the darkness. Gunfire flickered somewhere distant now. Voices barked orders, some English, some I couldn't identify. They weren't German. Were they reinforcements? I couldn't think that straight. Then everything faded to dark. Woke up on a pile of straw in a barn that might as well have been on the moon for all I knew. Jameson was there, barking commands with his old steel edge back. A few familiar faces stared blankly up at the rafters. Walsh among them, with a makeshift bandage over his missing eye, clutching a bottle nearly as big as his head. Not many of us left, not even half. It took more effort than it should have taken to focus on Jameson's words.
Supply columns stumbled over us, a sheer miracle. They thought we were long wiped out.
Later, huddled by a smoky fire that barely pricked at the lingering chill, Elliot found me.
Adler?
He started and stopped. He looked 10 years older, something broken and built anew behind those haunted eyes.
I still don't know what that thing in the woods was. Some mass hallucination brought on by stress or, well, by something else. Don't make me say it.
We both stared into the flames. He didn't have to try and justify anything anymore. Not to me, and maybe not even to himself.
Those figures at the stream,
I rasped, voice still rough.
Clark chanting, and those...
My mouth was dry, remembering their towering, inhuman shapes.
Were they helping? Or did they simply find our fear tastier than the Huns?
Does it matter now?
Elliot's answer was ragged.
What's real when a war itself feels like a fever dream?
He slumped forward, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles went white.
I saw those inscriptions. Those loops forming in your journal.
I knew this conversation wasn't over, that neither of us would go back to the men we were in training. Elliot might never return to his books or his neat equations explaining the world. Maybe my job now wasn't about documenting. Maybe it was about witnessing things nobody should have to witness, writing them down because if someone didn't, well then, wouldn't it be like they never happened at all?
There's one I haven't shown you yet.
I finally answered. One detail my shocked mind barely registered at the time.
This morning, as the trucks pulled away, I found it on a fresh page.
We shared a grim look, then I brought the journal near the flickering light. My finger traced the words written in shaky capitals. Tell no one. And, as always now, beneath those words, an impossibly precise set of dates, 1939, 1945. My heart twisted as those numbers sank in. Another war was coming. Not some hazy conflict from centuries past, but a world war larger and even more terrible than the one we just crawled out of. As I looked up from those figures at Elliot, I suddenly knew the shape of his future. No quiet library for him. He'd end up in another uniform, carrying a weapon, probably the kind they haven't even invented yet. And I could guess where this next notebook of mine might end up. Some archive gathering dust, maybe unearthed decades later by a different wide-eyed soldier clutching a pen, desperate to find some pattern, some answer, amidst the madness. Maybe we did owe whatever was left back in that godforsaken forest a debt. It let us go so we could carry its message. Perhaps this is how history is truly written, by broken men who lived so others might learn the lesson. For those future wars, maybe these fading pages become their own kind of warning. Here lived monsters. Beware their shadows. That night, when I tried to sleep, the tremor was back. Not below my boots this time. but running through my very bones. Not the ground shaking, but something deeper. My soul shaking, my sanity shaking. And a whispering part of my mind, the part now always attuned to those unseen currents, was already asking if another notebook would be enough come 1939. If anything would be enough, ever again. The fog hadn't fully lifted, after all. In some ways, it never would. The words flowed with hesitant ease, like water returning to a dried-up riverbed. My hand ached, but I found release in filling the pages. The cabin was dead silent now, no longer echoing with whispers and half-glimpsed forms. An empty silence. No, not quite empty. There was peace within it, relief too stark to savor fully. My fight was finished, but the war I was a pawn in. That war might echo through centuries. As the pale morning light filtered through the dirty window, I set down my pen, my eyes raw and my body protesting the relentless hours of cramped writing. In that stillness, my mind began to retrace the events of the last few months. I saw the desperation that drove me to take on this suicide commission, the creeping terror as I uncovered the blood lineages, the madness that twisted around me like fog on the moor. And then, that final revelation, the yawning chasm of unknowable truths. We found the heart of the darkness. I won't glorify it by calling it the source. Yet as we battled against, what should I call them? Entities bound to the land? Echoes of ancient evil? I couldn't tell you if there was true malevolence in what we battled. All I know is that we stopped something terrible from blooming into full horror, at least for now. My companions paid dearly. Some gave their lives. Those of us who survived will carry the scars for the rest of our days. And that was how I found myself a shattered echo of a man, penning my account. There is no triumphant wrap-up here. The ending is frayed, unfinished, still dripping with a dread that won't leave me. The truth. Is there even such a thing anymore? I saw things that defy human understanding. I stumbled in the blind between reality and nightmare so often the edges have worn thin. I was driven half-mad by powers I neither comprehend nor control. Was my survival due to chance? Was I aided by some force? Was it merely my desperation that clawed me free? In those final moments, as the earth roared in revolt and the world seemed to break under our feet, there was a sense of pattern shifting, something ancient bending toward us. I doubt any words I muster can ever do justice to what we witnessed, let alone what it might mean. As my final testament, I record our struggles and triumphs for what they're worth. I feel an obligation. Maybe not to humanity. The lines have blurred so far that those old divisions matter little anymore. But I owe it to those unseen forces, whatever they were. Maybe this document itself is fuel for an eldritch fire that's still slowly kindling. I can't know. My role now is mere scribe, not warrior. I've always believed in the tangible, the provable. This forced open my eyes to something vast and terrible, something I still refuse to accept entirely. Yet, I've lived it. Maybe we, as humans, are simply too limited to see the entirety of the game being played. We're ants gazing at the tip of an iceberg, unaware of the endless frozen mountains below the waves. Perhaps this will be my legacy, a fragment of truth for some future wanderer, some brave or perhaps foolish soul, who seeks to peel back the curtain of our reality. Let them find this warning, learn from what we stumbled upon, perhaps use it to shield themselves, or at least understand the forces they will undoubtedly face when they inevitably face them. I'd always prided myself on my sense of control, my orderliness. Now chaos is etched into my very bones. Despite the exhaustion, sleep was still miles away. My thoughts looped with manic clarity, forcing me to face the final piece of this unsettling puzzle. I needed one more entry, not for myself, but to bring everything brutally full circle. February 9th, 1915. Elliot was found and recovered after 3 months missing. He was found confused and unable to explain how he ended up hundreds of miles in the UK's Mallerstang Valley. He was found wandering the moors, dazed and barely lucid, claiming to have survived amidst an unseasonable blizzard. There were no reports of such weather phenomena in the region at the time. Despite medical care, Elliot never fully recovered his faculties. He died under mysterious circumstances shortly after, reportedly having flung himself from his upper story window. While an accident could not be ruled out, witnesses at the asylum where he spent his final days stated the recluse was often gripped by fits of terror, speaking of monsters dwelling in the stones. I placed the journal down, my internal fears and confusion echoing in my ears. The story never truly ends. It's a chilling realization, not of an end, but a cruel echo, a loop perpetuating through decades. Had I simply become the latest pawn?
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Quantum Dispatches, and stay tuned next week for another thrilling adventure. Thank you for listening.